Throughout centuries of intellectual inquiry, thinkers had been wrestling with questions that seemed impossible to resolve. They debated whether human minds could grasp ultimate reality, whether logical reasoning alone could establish the existence of a supreme being, whether judgments of beauty reflected objective truths or merely personal preferences. Immanuel Kant demonstrated that these very questions were formulated upon flawed premises about the nature of human understanding itself. What renders Kant genuinely extraordinary is not merely that he provided solutions to age-old philosophical dilemmas, but that he revealed the precise reasons why these challenges had remained insurmountable for so long. He discovered that human consciousness does not operate as a neutral receptor, passively absorbing information from an external world, but functions instead as a creative force that actively shapes and organizes every aspect of what we encounter and experience. This profound realization launched what he described as a Copernican transformation in philosophy, matching in importance the way Copernicus revolutionized astronomy by repositioning the Sun at the center of our planetary system rather than the Earth. Beyond this theoretical breakthrough, Kant constructed something far more comprehensive. He built a complete foundation for moral philosophy based purely on rational principles and human worth. He formulated an innovative account of aesthetic experience that united emotional response with reasoned judgment. He envisioned a future of lasting peace between nations, achieved through binding international agreements that still influences political theory today. Most significantly, Kant illuminated what it means to exist as a human being in the deepest possible sense. We are creatures who inhabit two realms simultaneously. Within the natural realm, we remain subject to physical causation like any material object. Within the moral realm, we emerge as free agents capable of determining our actions, according to principles we establish through reason itself. This dual existence grants us both extraordinary worth and profound obligation. The exploration of Kantian philosophy demands careful attention, yet offers transformative rewards. His concepts require patient reflection and sustained consideration. Those who undertake this intellectual journey discover not abstract theories, disconnected from life, but practical wisdom for living a meaningful human existence. Every idea we shall examine connects to fundamental questions about how you should understand the world, choose your actions, and relate to other people and the reality surrounding you. This comprehensive investigation will guide you through every major dimension of Kantian philosophical thought. We shall observe how his ideas evolved from early scientific interest toward his mature critical philosophy. We shall understand why his contemporaries called him the demolisher of all previous philosophical systems and the constructor of something entirely unprecedented. Most importantly, we shall recognize why Kantian insights remain as vital in our contemporary world as they were more than 2 centuries ago when first articulated. The journey through these ideas begins with understanding the man himself and the intellectual environment that shaped his revolutionary thinking. Kant emerged from a specific time and place, yet his conclusions transcended all particular circumstances to address universal features of human experience. His background in both rationalist and empiricist traditions allowed him to perceive limitations in each approach that others had missed. His training in mathematics and natural science gave him models of certain knowledge that philosophy needed to explain. His deep religious upbringing instilled moral seriousness that persisted even as he rejected traditional theological arguments. All these influences converged to produce a thinker capable of reimagining the entire philosophical enterprise from its foundations. What you will encounter in this exploration is not a museum piece of historical interest only, but a living body of thought that speaks directly to contemporary concerns. Questions about the limits of scientific knowledge, the foundations of moral obligation, the nature of beauty and art, the possibilities for lasting peace among nations, all these remain urgent in our world. Kant addressed each of these domains with systematic rigor and profound insight. His answers may not always convince, his arguments may sometimes perplex, yet his questions continue to define the terrain on which philosophy operates. Engaging seriously with Kantian thought means accepting the challenge of difficult ideas that resist quick summary or easy comprehension. The reward for this intellectual labor extends beyond philosophical understanding to transformed perspectives on existence itself. Consider how rare it is to encounter a thinker whose work fundamentally altered the course of human thought across multiple disciplines simultaneously. Kant reshaped not only philosophy proper, but also influenced theology, political science, aesthetics, psychology, and jurisprudence. His impact extended beyond academic circles to affect practical institutions and social movements. Democratic constitutions, international courts, theories of education, approaches to criminal justice all bear traces of Kantian influence whether explicitly acknowledged or not. This reach across domains reflects the systematic character of his thinking, the way each part of his philosophy connects to and supports every other part. Understanding any single aspect of Kantian thought eventually requires grasping the whole, yet the whole can only be approached through patient examination of individual components. This creates a hermeneutic circle that rewards sustained engagement rather than superficial survey. The structure of what follows will guide you through this circle systematically, building understanding incrementally while keeping the broader architecture in view. We begin with the biographical and intellectual context that shaped Kant's development, then proceed through his three major critical works, examining the revolutionary insights each contains and how they fit together into a unified philosophical vision. Along the way, we shall encounter some of the most profound and challenging ideas in the history of human thought, ideas that continue to reward careful consideration and thoughtful application to the questions that matter most in human life. Immanuel Kant entered the world on the 22nd day of April in the year 1724 in the Prussian city of Königsberg, a thriving commercial centre that housed one of Europe's most distinguished universities. His father earned a modest living as a craftsman who made harnesses for horses, while his mother embodied deep religious conviction that shaped young Immanuel's character from his earliest years. The Kant household belonged to the Pietist movement within Protestant Christianity, an approach to faith that emphasized personal spiritual experience and moral conduct over formal theological doctrine. This early immersion in Pietist thought profoundly influenced the mature philosopher's emphasis on duty and the priority of practical moral reason over abstract theoretical speculation about religious matters. The Königsberg, where Kant spent his entire life, was far from provincial, despite never travelling more than a few miles from his birthplace. Ships arrived daily bearing goods and ideas from across the European continent. The university attracted scholars from throughout the German-speaking territories, creating an atmosphere of intellectual vitality that proved essential to Kant's development. This cosmopolitan environment, where German, Polish, Russian and Lithuanian cultures intersected and intermingled, helped foster the universal outlook that would later lead him to envision a federation of nations committed to perpetual peace through international law rather than recurring military conflict. At 16 years of age, Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg, where he first encountered the philosophical system of Christian Wolff, the dominant German philosopher of the early 18th century. Wolff had systematized the rationalist philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz into an elaborate structure that claimed to derive all genuine knowledge from pure reason operating independently of sensory experience. However, Kant also studied under Martin Knutzen, a professor who introduced him to the empirical methods pioneered by Isaac Newton and the skeptical arguments advanced by David Hume. This exposure to both rationalist and empiricist intellectual traditions planted the seeds of the great synthesis that would characterize his mature philosophy. Knutzen proved a fascinating figure who combined sincere religious faith with cutting-edge scientific knowledge. He was among the first German scholars to fully comprehend the revolutionary implications of Newtonian physics for understanding the natural world. Under Knutsen's influence, Kant began to perceive that mathematics and physics revealed universal laws governing natural phenomena with absolute necessity. This observation prompted his first major philosophical question. If nature operates according to universal principles that human reason can discover and comprehend, might there exist similar universal principles governing human thought and action that reason could likewise discover? In 1746, when Kant reached 22 years of age, his father died, leaving the family in difficult financial circumstances. Kant was forced to withdraw from the university without completing his degree, and accept employment as a private tutor for wealthy families in the Königsberg countryside. This 9-year period of relative isolation from academic life proved crucial to his intellectual development. Away from the pressures and conventions of university culture, he found time to think deeply and independently about fundamental problems in philosophy and science. During these years of tutoring, Kant composed his first significant work, a treatise titled Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces, which attempted to resolve a dispute between followers of Leibniz and Newton regarding the proper method for measuring force in physical systems. Though the work attracted little attention from the scholarly community, it revealed the synthetic approach that would become the hallmark of his mature philosophy. Instead of simply choosing one side in an existing debate, Kant sought to identify partial truths in opposing viewpoints and synthesize them into a more comprehensive understanding. This method of seeking synthesis between opposing positions rather than merely taking sides would characterize all his later work. In 1755, Kant returned to the university, completed his doctoral degree, and launched his career as a lecturer. For the next 15 years, he taught a remarkable range of subjects including mathematics, physics, geography, anthropology, logic, metaphysics, and ethics. This extraordinarily broad teaching experience proved invaluable because it compelled him to think systematically about how different areas of human knowledge relate to and complement one another. He began to perceive that all human intellectual activities, from scientific investigation to moral judgment to aesthetic appreciation, might operate according to common underlying principles that careful analysis could reveal. During this pre-critical period, as scholars designate it, Kant published important works on astronomy, anthropology, and natural philosophy. His universal natural history and theory of the heavens proposed what became known as the nebula hypothesis concerning the formation of the solar system from a rotating cloud of gas and dust. This work demonstrated his capacity to think systematically about the largest possible questions, his refusal to study isolated phenomena without attempting to understand the fundamental principles governing entire domains of reality. The event that awakened Kant from what he later called his dogmatic slumber was his encounter with the writings of David Hume during the 1760s. Hume had argued that we can never rationally justify our belief in causation, the existence of an external world independent of our perceptions, or even the continuity of personal identity through time. If Hume's arguments were valid, then science, morality, and everyday reasoning about experience all lacked any secure rational foundation. This conclusion seemed to lead inevitably toward complete skepticism about the possibility of human knowledge. Yet Kant realized that Hume's devastating arguments, while successfully demolishing previous philosophical systems, actually pointed toward a solution rather than merely creating an insoluble problem. The difficulty was not that human reason proves unreliable, but rather that philosophers had fundamentally misunderstood how reason operates. They had assumed that knowledge must derive either entirely from reason operating independently of experience or entirely from experience operating independently of reason. Kant perceived that this represented a false choice. What if genuine knowledge requires both sensory input from experience and conceptual organization from reason working together? What if the mind actively structures experience rather than passively receiving it? What if space, time, causation, and other fundamental features of experience represent contributions of the mind rather than properties belonging to things, as they exist completely independently of all minds? In 1781, at the age of 57, Kant published the work that would transform philosophy forever and establish him as one of the most important thinkers in human history. The Critique of Pure Reason emerged from more than a decade of intensive reflection on the fundamental nature of human knowledge and the proper limits of rational inquiry. Kant later revealed that he had been working on the problems addressed in this monumental book for nearly 12 years, yet the actual composition took only 4 to 5 months in an extraordinary burst of creative intensity. The remarkable speed of writing demonstrates how thoroughly he had worked out his revolutionary ideas during the long period of silent preparation that preceded publication. The central question animating the first critique appears deceptively simple, yet proved revolutionary in its implications. How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? To grasp why this question transformed philosophy so profoundly, we must understand precisely what Kant meant by these technical terms and why their combination seemed paradoxical to previous thinkers. Analytic judgments are those where the predicate concept is already contained within the subject concept, such as the statement that all bachelors are unmarried men. Synthetic judgments add genuinely new information not contained in the subject, such as the claim that this particular bachelor is wealthy. Knowledge classified as a priori is independent of particular experiences, while a posteriori knowledge derives from sensory experience of the world. Most philosophers before Kant simply assumed that all a priori knowledge must be analytic, consisting merely of conceptual analysis that unpacks what is already implicitly contained in our concepts, while all synthetic knowledge that adds new information must be a posteriori, derived from experience. But Kant realized that mathematics and the fundamental principles of natural science are both synthetic and a priori simultaneously. Mathematical judgments like 7 plus 5 equals 12 are synthetic because the concept of 12 is not contained analytically within the separate concepts of 7 and 5 taken individually. Yet mathematical truths are also a priori because they possess universal and necessary validity, not dependent on particular experiences. Similarly, scientific principles such as the law that every event has a cause are synthetic, because causation is not contained analytically in the mere concept of an event. Yet they are a priori because they apply universally to all possible experience with absolute necessity. The existence of synthetic a priori knowledge proves conclusively that the mind actively contributes structural elements to experience, rather than passively receiving whatever reality impresses upon it. If we could only know things through passive reception of sensory data, all knowledge would be either analytic unpacking of concepts or merely empirical generalization from particular experiences. The fact that we possess universal and necessary knowledge about the empirical world demonstrates that the mind imposes its own forms and categories onto the raw material of sensation, actively organizing experience according to principles that originate in reason itself rather than in the objects experienced. This revolutionary insight became the foundation of what Kant termed transcendental idealism, a position that fundamentally reconceived the relationship between mind and world. Kant divided the critique of pure reason into two major sections that reveal different dimensions of how the mind structures experience a priori. The transcendental aesthetic examines the pure forms of sensible intuition, while the transcendental logic investigates the concepts and principles of understanding. Each section discloses distinct ways that mental faculties contribute necessary structure to experience before any particular empirical content is encountered. The aesthetic demonstrates that space and time are not properties belonging to things, as they exist in themselves independently of minds, but rather the necessary forms through which we must intuit any object whatsoever. The logic establishes that we apply 12 fundamental categories to organize our intuitions into coherent experience of objective reality. The method Kant employed throughout the first critique was entirely unprecedented in the history of philosophy. He called it transcendental analysis because it seeks to discover the a priori conditions that make experience possible in the first place. Instead of asking what we can know about objects considered as independent entities, Kant asked what must be true of our cognitive faculties in order for us to have the kind of experience we actually possess. This shift from studying objects to studying the conditions of possibility of experiencing objects constituted the essence of his Copernican revolution in philosophy. The critique established strict and definite limits on what pure reason can legitimately accomplish. Reason can provide genuine knowledge only when applied to objects of possible experience, phenomena that appear within the forms of space and time and can be organized through the categories of understanding. When reason attempts to transcend these limits and speculate about things in themselves as they exist completely independently of all possible experience, it inevitably falls into contradictions and generates illusions that masquerade as knowledge but lack any legitimate foundation. This is why traditional metaphysics, which claim to prove the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the freedom of the will through pure reason alone operating independently of experience, must be rejected as impossible in principle. However, Kant's limitation of theoretical knowledge to possible experience was not a skeptical conclusion that undermined human understanding. On the contrary, by showing exactly what pure reason can and cannot accomplish. Kant secured the foundations of mathematics, natural science, and empirical knowledge generally on solid ground. He demonstrated that these forms of knowledge rest on a priori foundations that guarantee their validity while simultaneously explaining why metaphysical speculation beyond the bounds of possible experience inevitably fails to produce genuine knowledge. As he famously expressed it, he found it necessary to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith, meaning that by establishing the proper boundaries of theoretical reason, he opened space for practical reason and moral faith. The first edition of the Critique was largely ignored or profoundly misunderstood when it initially appeared. Many readers found the work impossibly difficult and abstract, struggling to comprehend its novel terminology and complex arguments. Others interpreted it as a form of idealism similar to that proposed by George Berkeley, which denied the existence of material objects independent of perception. Kant felt deeply frustrated by these misinterpretations and devoted considerable effort to clarifying his position in subsequent works. In 1787, he published a substantially revised second edition that included important clarifications and a new section explicitly titled The Refutation of Idealism, designed to demonstrate that his transcendental idealism actually entailed empirical realism rather than skepticism about external reality. The Transcendental Aesthetic, the opening major section of the Critique of Pure Reason, contains some of Kant's most revolutionary and counterintuitive claims about the nature of reality and human perception. Here Kant argues that space and time are not features of reality as it exists independently of minds, but rather the necessary forms through which human sensibility must represent any object whatsoever. This doctrine carries profound implications for how we understand the nature of physical reality, the foundations of mathematics, and the structure of human experience itself. To comprehend Kant's argument, we must first distinguish carefully between sensation and intuition, two terms that sound similar but designate fundamentally different aspects of experience. Sensation is the raw material that affects our sense organs when we encounter objects in the world around us. But sensation by itself constitutes merely a chaotic manifold of unorganized impressions without any inherent structure or meaningful content. Intuition is sensation organized through the pure forms of space and time into coherent representations of objects located in definite spatial and temporal relations to one another and to ourselves as perceiving subjects. Kant offers several interconnected arguments for the ideality of space and time, each designed to demonstrate that they cannot be features belonging to things as they exist in themselves, independent of any relation to perceiving minds. The metaphysical exposition argues that space and time are a priori representations that must be presupposed as necessary conditions for any outer or inner experience whatsoever. We cannot represent objects as existing outside of spatial and temporal relations, nor can we represent space and time themselves as being absent from experience. Yet we can represent empty space and time devoid of any particular objects, which shows that space and time are more fundamental than any particular spatial or temporal contents they may contain. The Transcendental Exposition argues that space and time must be pure intuitions, rather than empirical concepts, because mathematics depends entirely on the construction of concepts in pure intuition, rather than on analysis of abstract concepts. Geometry constructs its concepts by drawing lines, angles, and figures in space, not by analyzing verbal definitions or manipulating logical symbols. Similarly, arithmetic constructs numbers through successive synthesis in time, adding units together in temporal sequence. If space and time were merely empirical concepts derived from particular experiences, mathematics could not possess the universal and necessary validity that it clearly and undeniably possesses across all possible applications. Consider carefully what this revolutionary doctrine means for our understanding of physical reality and the world we inhabit. Everything we experience as physical, every object we perceive through the senses, every material thing we encounter, exists only within the framework of space and time that our own minds necessarily provide as conditions of experience. The chair supporting your body, the room surrounding you, even your own physical body as an object of perception, all exist as spatial and temporal objects only because your mind organizes sensory impressions through spatial and temporal relations. This does not mean these objects are mere illusions or fantasies conjured by imagination without any basis in reality. But it does mean they exist only as appearances to beings with our particular cognitive structure, not as things in themselves, independent of all possible experience. The implications for physics and natural science prove equally dramatic and far-reaching. All the laws of physics describe relationships between objects existing in space and time, mathematical relationships that govern how material things move and interact. But space and time themselves are not features of reality independent of minds, according to Kant's analysis. This means that natural science gives us genuine and reliable knowledge, but only knowledge of how things appear to beings with our kind of sensibility and understanding. Physics cannot tell us what reality is like as it exists in itself, completely independently of any possible experience, only how it must appear to rational beings who represent objects through spatial and temporal intuitions, organized by categories of understanding. Kant's theory also explains the nature and validity of mathematics in a completely new way that resolves long-standing puzzles. Mathematics is not about abstract objects existing in some Platonic realm independent of space and time, nor is it merely a useful conventional tool for describing empirical patterns we happen to observe. Rather, mathematics describes the necessary structure of any possible experience for beings constituted like ourselves. Geometric truths hold with absolute necessity because space itself possesses the structure that geometry describes, and space is the form through which we must represent any outer object whatsoever. The temporal dimension proves equally important but more complex and subtle, because time functions as the form of inner sense, as well as a condition of all outer experience. Everything we experience, whether outer objects located in space or inner states of consciousness, must be represented as occurring in temporal succession and duration. Memory, anticipation, the continuous flow of consciousness itself, all depend fundamentally on the temporal framework that the mind brings to experience as an a priori condition. Without time as a pure form of intuition, we could have no coherent experience of change, causation, persistence through alteration, or personal identity through time. But if space and time are ideal rather than real properties of things in themselves, what can we say about things as they exist independently of our experience? Kant insisted that things in themselves genuinely exist but are neither spatial nor temporal in their intrinsic nature. This seems paradoxical and difficult to grasp because we cannot conceive or imagine existing things that possess neither spatial nor temporal properties. But Kant argued that this limitation reflects the boundaries of human knowledge and the structure of human cognition, not the ultimate nature of reality itself. We can think the concept of non-spatial and non-temporal existence through abstract reasoning, even though we cannot intuit such existence or form any concrete image of what it might be like. This leads to one of the most challenging and debated aspects of Kant's entire system, the problem of affection. If things in themselves are not spatial or temporal, how can they affect our senses and provide the sensory content that our minds organize through space and time? Causation itself seems to be fundamentally a temporal relation between events occurring in sequence. So how can non-temporal things function as causes of our sensations and perceptions? Kant acknowledged this difficulty, but insisted that we must distinguish carefully between empirical causation, which operates within the framework of space and time among phenomena, and whatever relation exists between things in themselves and the appearances they somehow ground. Having established that space and time are pure forms of sensible intuition, through which we must represent all objects, Kant turned to an even more fundamental question in the transcendental logic. How does the mind organize the spatial and temporal manifold of intuition into coherent experience of objective reality? The answer resides in what Kant called the pure concepts of understanding or categories, which are a priori concepts that the mind must apply to any possible experience in order to transform mere sensations into knowledge of objects. Kant argued that human understanding operates discursively rather than intuitively, meaning that we can only know objects by applying concepts to intuitions we receive through sensibility. Unlike a divine intellect that might intuit objects directly in their complete reality, human understanding must think objects through concepts that unite the manifold of sensible intuition under general rules and principles. This discursive nature of human cognition makes categories absolutely necessary, for any experience of objects whatsoever. Without categories organizing the raw material of sensation, we would possess only a chaotic stream of unconnected impressions without any unity, objectivity, or meaningful content. The most original and philosophically demanding part of Kant's theoretical philosophy is his derivation of the categories from the logical functions of judgment employed in ordinary thinking. Kant observed that all thinking necessarily involves judgment, and judgment involves bringing representations under concepts according to certain determinate logical forms that can be systematically classified. Traditional logic had identified 12 basic forms that judgments can take. Universal judgments apply to all members of a class, particular judgments apply to some members, singular judgments apply to one individual. Affirmative judgments assert that a predicate belongs to a subject. Negative judgments deny this belonging. Infinite judgments involve a kind of limiting negation. Categorical judgments state simple subject-predicate relations. Hypothetical judgments state conditional relations between judgments. Disjunctive judgments state alternative possibilities. Problematic judgments claim mere possibility. Assertoric judgments claim actuality. Epidictic judgments claim necessity. Kant argued that corresponding to each logical function of judgment, there must exist a pure concept of understanding that enables us to apply that logical function to the manifold of intuition we receive through sensibility. This yields 12 categories organized into 4 groups of 3 categories each, parallel to the 4 groups of logical functions. The categories of quantity are unity, plurality, and totality, corresponding to singular, particular, and universal judgments respectively. The categories of quality are reality, negation, and limitation, corresponding to affirmative, negative, and infinite judgments. The categories of relation are inherence and subsistence, which we call substance and accident, causality and dependence, which we call cause and effect, and community, which we call reciprocal interaction. The categories of modality are possibility and impossibility, existence and non-existence, and necessity and contingency, corresponding to problematic, assertoric, and apodictic judgments. Each category plays an essential and indispensable role in making objective experience possible for beings with our cognitive structure. The category of substance allows us to distinguish between persisting objects that endure through time and their changing properties that come and go. Without this category, we could not experience a world of enduring things that undergo alteration while remaining numerically identical through change. The category of causality enables us to connect events in necessary succession according to rules rather than merely observing one thing happening after another in temporal sequence. The category of unity allows us to recognize diverse properties as belonging to a single unified object rather than experiencing only disconnected qualities floating free without any bearer. But Kant faced a crucial and unprecedented problem that no previous philosopher had adequately addressed. How can we be certain that these categories, which are pure concepts originating in understanding rather than derived from experience, actually apply validly to the empirical intuitions we receive through sensibility? This is what Kant called the problem of the transcendental deduction of the categories, and solving it proved essential to his entire critical project. It is not sufficient merely to show that we possess these concepts in our cognitive repertoire. We must prove rigorously that they necessarily apply to any possible experience, that objects of experience must conform to categorical principles. Otherwise, there would be no guarantee that our conceptual thinking corresponds to the objects we experience, and skepticism about knowledge would remain unanswered. Kant's ingenious solution was to demonstrate that the same spontaneous activity of understanding that produces the logical unity of concepts in judgment also produces the synthetic unity of intuitions in experience itself. The understanding does not merely think concepts in abstraction from experience. It actively synthesizes the manifold of intuition according to rules that correspond precisely to the categories, and this synthesis is what transforms mere sensations into coherent experience of objective reality. Therefore, the categories must apply necessarily to anything that can count as an object of experience for beings constituted like ourselves, because objects of experience are constituted as objects through the very application of categories. The transcendental unity of apperception plays an absolutely crucial role in this complex argument. Kant argued that all my representations must be capable of being accompanied by the thought, I think. Otherwise they would not be my representations at all, but merely isolated mental states with no connection to a unified consciousness. This, I think, is not itself an object of experience that we encounter among other objects, but rather the formal condition that makes any unified experience possible in the first place. The same synthetic activity that produces this transcendental unity of self-consciousness also produces the objective unity of experience through systematic application of categories to organize the manifold of intuition. This leads to one of Kant's most important and revolutionary conclusions about the nature of objects and experience. Objects of experience are not things in themselves existing independently of our cognitive activity, but rather appearances constituted by the synthesizing activity of understanding operating according to categorical rules. When we experience a house as a unified object, we are not passively receiving impressions from a house that exists completely independently of our cognitive faculties. Rather, we are actively organizing spatial and temporal intuitions through categories like substance, unity, plurality, and causality to constitute the representation of a house as an objective unity. The house exists as a genuine empirical object, not a mere illusion or fantasy, but it exists only within the framework of human cognition and experience, not as a thing in itself. The categories also provide the indispensable foundation for what Kant called the principles of pure understanding, which are synthetic a priori judgments that apply universally and necessarily to all objects of possible experience. These fundamental principles include the axioms of intuition, which state that all intuitions are extensive magnitudes that can be measured, the anticipations of perception, which state that sensation possesses intensive magnitude or degree, the analogies of experience, which include the principles of substance permanence, causal succession, and reciprocal interaction, and the postulates of empirical thinking, which define the conditions for possibility, actuality, and necessity as applied to objects of experience. The transcendental deduction of the categories stands as perhaps the most difficult yet most important argument in the entire critique of pure reason, and indeed in the whole history of modern philosophy. Here Kant attempts to prove rigorously that the 12 categories must necessarily apply to all objects of possible experience without exception. Without this proof successfully established, the categories would remain merely subjective concepts originating in our minds with no guaranteed relationship to the objective world we claim to know through experience. The success or failure of this argument determines whether Kant can justify synthetic a priori knowledge and avoid both dogmatic rationalism that claims too much and skeptical empiricism that concedes too little. The problem Kant faced was genuinely unprecedented in the entire philosophical tradition. Previous philosophers had simply assumed without argument that our concepts somehow correspond adequately to reality, either because concepts are innate ideas implanted in us by a benevolent creator, or because concepts are abstracted directly from experience itself through a process of generalization. But Kant had already demonstrated that the most fundamental concepts of understanding, the categories, are neither innate in the rationalist sense of being present in the mind from birth, nor derive from experience in the empiricist sense of being generalized from particular sensory observations. They are pure concepts that understanding contributes to experience a priori as conditions of possibility. How then can we be certain they apply validly to the objects we experience rather than being merely arbitrary constructions? Kant's brilliant strategy was to show that the same spontaneous activity of understanding that produces conceptual unity in judgments also produces objective unity in experience itself through a process of synthesis. This argument proceeds through several interconnected steps, each revealing a different aspect of how understanding constitutes experience rather than merely receiving it passively. The key insight is that experience itself is not a passive reception of fully formed objects given to consciousness, but rather an active synthesis performed by understanding according to a priori rules that correspond to the categories. The argument begins with what Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception, which must be carefully distinguished from empirical self-consciousness. This is not the empirical awareness of oneself as a particular person with specific characteristics, memories, and traits. Rather, it is the formal condition that makes any unified consciousness possible in the first place. For any set of representations to constitute a single coherent experience belonging to one subject, they must all be capable of being connected in one consciousness that can think, I think, in relation to all of them. As Kant expressed it, all my representations must be capable of being accompanied by the I think, otherwise they would be nothing to me, mere isolated mental states with no connection to a unified experiencing subject. But this transcendental unity of apperception is not simply given as a brute fact about consciousness. It must be actively produced through an act of synthesis that combines diverse representations into unified experience. The manifold of intuition comes to us initially as merely a succession of different representations without any inherent unity or organization. To transform this chaotic manifold into unified experience of objects, understanding must actively connect these representations according to rules that correspond to the categories. This synthesis is what Kant called the transcendental synthesis of imagination, guided by the categories as fundamental rules for combining representations into objective experience. The crucial and revolutionary move in the argument is Kant's claim that this same synthesis that produces the unity of consciousness also produces the objectivity of experience through a single unified act. When I experience a house as an objective unity, the synthesis that enables me to think of diverse visual impressions of walls, roof, windows, and door as belonging to my unified consciousness is the very same synthesis that constitutes these representations as representations of one objective house existing independently of my particular subjective states. There is not first a subjective unity of my consciousness, and then separately an objective reference to an independent object. Rather, objective reference to objects and subjective unity of consciousness are two inseparable aspects of the same fundamental synthetic activity of understanding operating according to categorical rules. This means that the categories as rules for synthesis must apply necessarily to any possible object of experience without exception. Objects of experience are not independent entities existing prior to cognition that we subsequently think about through categories we happen to possess. Rather, objects of experience are constituted as objects in the first place through the application of categories to the manifold of intuition. Without categories organizing sensory material, there would be no objects of experience whatsoever, only a formless chaos of sensations without any organization, unity, or objective significance. Kant illustrated this profound point with his famous distinction between subjective and objective temporal succession of representations. When I observe a house standing before me, I can survey its parts in any arbitrary order I choose, looking first at the roof, then at the foundation, or vice versa. The temporal sequence in which my perceptions occur is merely subjective, telling us nothing about the object perceived, but only about the contingent path my attention happened to take. But when I observe a ship moving downstream on a river, the temporal sequence of my perceptions is objectively necessary and determined by the object itself. I must perceive the ship first in one position upstream, then in another position downstream. I cannot reverse this order because it is determined by the objective motion of the ship itself, rather than by my subjective choice. This objectivity of temporal succession is constituted by applying the category of causality to organize the manifold of intuition according to necessary rules. The deduction also explains how we can possess synthetic a priori knowledge about objects of experience despite never encountering these objects prior to experience. Because objects of experience are constituted as objects through the application of categories, and because categories are a priori concepts of understanding rather than concepts derived from particular experiences, we can know a priori that all objects of experience must necessarily conform to categorical principles. This is not because we arbitrarily impose forms on an independent reality that might have a completely different structure, but because to be an object of experience means precisely to be synthesized according to categorical rules. However, the deduction also establishes strict and definite limits on the legitimate scope of categorical knowledge. Categories apply necessarily and universally to objects of possible experience, but only to such objects and to nothing beyond them. We cannot use categories to gain theoretical knowledge of things as they exist independently of all possible experience. The distinction between phenomena and noumena stands at the very heart of Kantian transcendental idealism, and represents one of his most controversial yet influential contributions to philosophical thought. This distinction emerges directly and necessarily from the results of the transcendental aesthetic and transcendental analytic, which demonstrated conclusively that human knowledge is limited strictly to objects of possible experience. But understanding the precise nature of this fundamental distinction requires careful analysis of what Kant meant by phenomena, what he meant by noumena, and how these two concepts relate to his overall critical project of establishing both the possibilities and the limits of human reason. Phenomena or appearances are not mere illusions, fantasies, or subjective projections without any basis in reality, but rather the actual objects of empirical knowledge as they exist for finite, rational beings like ourselves. When you perceive a tree standing in a forest, the tree you experience is a phenomenon, a genuine object of knowledge that exists independently of your individual consciousness and would continue to exist even if you turned away and stopped observing it. But this tree exists as an object only within the framework of human sensibility and understanding, within the forms of space and time and under the categories of substance, causality and unity. It appears in space and time because space and time are the necessary forms through which we must intuit any object whatsoever. It exhibits properties like substantial persistence, causal interactions, and unified identity because these categories are necessary conditions for any possible experience of objective reality. This does not make the phenomenal tree any less real than a tree could possibly be for beings constituted as we are. Kant was emphatic and unambiguous that transcendental idealism concerning the conditions of experience is perfectly compatible with empirical realism concerning the objects we encounter within experience. The objects we experience through scientific investigation and everyday observation are completely real and genuinely independent of individual subjective states. They simply are not real in the way naive realism supposes, as spatial and temporal objects existing with those properties independently of any possible relation to experiencing minds. Rather, they exist as the necessary objects of experience for beings with our particular cognitive constitution. Noumena, or things in themselves, represent whatever exists independently of all relations to finite cognition and experience. Kant insisted that we must think the concept of things in themselves, even though we cannot possess any theoretical knowledge about their positive properties or characteristics. The concept serves a crucial negative function by reminding us constantly of the limits of human knowledge and preventing us from mistakenly absolutizing the conditions of our own experience into supposed features of reality as it exists in itself. Without the concept of things in themselves standing as a kind of boundary concept, we might fall into the error of thinking that space, time, and the categories characterize reality absolutely, rather than characterizing only reality as it appears to beings with our sensible and intellectual faculties. But how should we understand the relationship between phenomena and noumena more precisely? This question has generated enormous controversy among Kant scholars and interpreters throughout more than 2 centuries. Some interpreters defend what is called a two-aspect theory, according to which phenomena and noumena are 2 ways of considering the very same objects rather than 2 distinct types of entities. Others defend what is called a two-object theory, according to which phenomena and noumena are genuinely distinct kinds of things. Each interpretation faces serious textual and philosophical difficulties that resist easy resolution. The two-aspect theory seems to fit well with certain passages where Kant claims that things in themselves are the same object as appearances considered from a different standpoint or perspective. When I think of myself as an object of empirical psychology studied scientifically, I consider myself as a phenomenon subject to natural laws of cause and effect. When I think of myself as a moral agent capable of acting from duty, I consider myself as a noumenal capable of free action. These are 2 ways of thinking about the same being, not 2 numerically different beings existing in separate realms. But the two-aspect theory struggles to explain adequately Kant's repeated doctrine of affection. Kant clearly and repeatedly states that phenomena result from the way things in themselves affect our sensibility, providing the raw material of sensation that our cognitive faculties then organize into experience. This seems to imply a genuine causal relationship between numerically distinct entities rather than merely 2 aspects of identical entities. Moreover, causation is itself a category that applies only within the phenomenal realm, according to Kant's own principles. So it seems deeply problematic to invoke causal relations to explain the relationship between noumena and phenomena, which would require applying categories beyond their legitimate domain. The two-object theory avoids these particular problems by treating phenomena and noumena as genuinely distinct types of entities with different modes of existence. Things in themselves exist independently of experience and somehow affect our sensibility to produce the raw sensory material that our cognitive faculties organize into phenomenal objects through the forms of space and time and the categories of understanding. This interpretation seems to fit better with Kant's frequent claims about affection and his repeated insistence that appearances cannot be mere appearances of nothing, that there must be something that appears even if we cannot know theoretically what it is in its intrinsic nature. However, the two-object theory faces the devastating objection that it seems to make things in themselves completely unknowable while simultaneously claiming to know that they exist and that they affect us causally. If categories like existence and causation apply only to phenomena, as Kant argues, how can we meaningfully think or assert that noumena exist and cause our sensations? This seems to involve a fundamental contradiction at the very heart of the Kantian system. We would be using the very concepts whose legitimate application Kant limits strictly to phenomena in order to make claims about what lies beyond all possible phenomena. Perhaps the deepest and most troubling problem with the phenomena-noumena distinction is what scholars have called the problem of affection. Kant clearly needs things in themselves to affect our sensibility in order to provide the sensory content that our cognitive faculties organize into experience through synthesis. But affection seems necessarily to be a causal relationship occurring in time, with the affecting thing temporally prior to the effect it produces. And Kant has argued systematically that both causation and time are merely phenomenal, features of experience rather than features of reality in itself. So how can non-temporal, non-causal noumena stand in causal temporal relations to our sensibility? Some interpreters have attempted to resolve this apparent contradiction by distinguishing between empirical affection, which occurs within the phenomenal realm among appearances, and transcendental affection, which is the non-temporal ground of phenomena in things in themselves. Others have argued that affection should be understood not as a literal causal process, but rather as a limiting concept that expresses the receptivity and finitude of human cognition. In the Transcendental Dialectic, the final major section of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant revealed how pure reason inevitably generates illusions and falls into contradictions when it attempts to transcend the bounds of possible experience. These are not accidental errors that better reasoning or more careful logic could avoid, but rather necessary illusions that arise from the very nature of reason itself as a faculty that seeks systematic completeness and unconditional principles. Understanding these illusions proves crucial for grasping both the power and the limitations of human rational capacity. Reason seeks systematic unity and absolute completeness in all knowledge. It is never satisfied with the piecemeal knowledge that understanding provides through organizing particular experiences, but constantly demands totality and unconditional first principles that would ground all conditional knowledge. This drive towards systematic completeness is valuable and indeed necessary for organizing empirical knowledge into coherent theories and comprehensive sciences. But when reason attempts to achieve absolute completeness by going beyond all possible experience and grasping the unconditioned directly, it falls into inevitable contradictions that Kant termed antinomies of pure reason. The four antinomies of pure reason represent four fundamental questions that human reason cannot help asking but cannot possibly answer through theoretical knowledge. Each antinomy consists of a thesis and an antithesis, both of which seem to follow necessarily from rational principles and compelling arguments, yet which contradict each other completely and irreconcilably. This reveals that reason, when applied beyond its proper domain of possible experience, becomes self-contradictory and produces insoluble problems that admit of no theoretical resolution. The first antinomy concerns the question of whether the world is finite or infinite in space and time. The thesis argues that the world must have a beginning in time and be limited in space, because an infinite series could never be completed through successive synthesis starting from any given point. The antithesis argues that the world cannot have a beginning in time or limits in space. because any supposed beginning or boundary would necessarily presuppose empty time before it, or empty space beyond it, which contradicts the assumption of an absolute beginning or limit. Both arguments seem compelling and logically rigorous, yet they contradict each other completely, leaving reason in a state of paralysis. The second antinomy addresses whether composite substances consist ultimately of simple parts, or whether nothing simple exists anywhere in nature. The thesis contends that all composite substances must consist of simple indivisible parts, because composition is merely an external accidental relation that can be removed in thought, revealing the simple substances that enter into composition. The antithesis maintains that nothing simple can possibly exist in spatial reality, because anything that exists in space must be extended and therefore divisible into parts, and these parts must themselves be extended and divisible, continuing infinitely without ever reaching simple indivisible elements. Again, both arguments seem to follow from sound principles, yet they cannot both be true simultaneously. The third antinomy asks whether causation, according to universal natural laws, is sufficient to explain everything that happens, or whether free causation, independent of natural laws, is also necessary. The thesis argues that freedom must exist because an infinite regress of natural causes stretching back into the past cannot adequately explain the beginning of any causal series, which requires an uncaused cause capable of initiating new series spontaneously. The antithesis contends that freedom is impossible, because it would violate the fundamental principle of natural science that every event must have a cause according to universal laws, and admitting uncaused events would destroy the possibility of scientific knowledge. This antinomy has special importance for moral philosophy, since moral responsibility seems to require freedom from natural determination, yet science seems to require universal natural causation without exception. The fourth antinomy concerns whether an absolutely necessary being exists either as part of the world or as its cause. The thesis argues that something absolutely necessary must exist either in the world or as its transcendent cause, because the series of contingent beings cannot be complete or intelligible without an ultimate necessary ground. The antithesis maintains that no absolutely necessary being can exist anywhere, because necessity contradicts the temporal and contingent character of everything that exists in the world or in causal relation to it. This antinomy bears directly on traditional arguments for divine existence and the possibility of rational theology. Kant's ingenious solution to the antinomies depends crucially on the distinction between phenomena and noumena established earlier. The first two antinomies, which he called mathematical because they concern the quantity and composition of objects, are resolved by rejecting both thesis and antithesis as false. The world as a whole is neither finite nor infinite in space and time, neither simple nor infinitely divisible, because the world as an absolute totality is not an object of possible experience at all. We can always extend our empirical knowledge further in space and time, discovering more objects and dividing them further, but we can never achieve the absolute totality that reason demands. Both thesis and antithesis mistakenly assume that the world as a whole could be given as a completed object of knowledge. The last two antinomies, which Kant called dynamical because they concern the existence and causation of objects, allow for a different kind of solution that preserves elements of truth in both thesis and antithesis. Here both claims can be true simultaneously if they are properly distinguished and applied to different domains. In the phenomenal realm of appearances, everything may indeed follow natural laws without exception, satisfying the demands of natural science, while in the noumenal realm of things in themselves, freedom may be possible as a form of causality not subject to natural laws. Similarly, the series of phenomenal causes may contain no necessary being within it, while a necessary being may exist as the non-temporal ground of the entire phenomenal world. This solution to the third and fourth antinomies opens up logical space for moral freedom and religious belief without contradicting the legitimate demands of natural science. Science can claim that all phenomena follow universal natural laws, while morality can presuppose that rational agents are free as noumenal beings. Neither claim contradicts the other because they apply to different domains, phenomena, and noumena respectively. The categorical imperative stands as Kant's most famous and influential contribution to moral philosophy, and represents his systematic attempt to discover the fundamental law governing moral action and to ground ethics in pure practical reason rather than empirical considerations about human nature or consequences. Unlike hypothetical imperatives which tell us what we should do if we want to achieve particular goals or satisfy certain desires, the categorical imperative commands unconditionally, applying to all rational beings simply by virtue of their rationality, regardless of their particular desires, circumstances, or cultural backgrounds. Kant arrived at the categorical imperative through careful analysis of ordinary moral consciousness and the implicit presuppositions of everyday moral judgment. He observed that when we make moral judgments about actions, we implicitly claim universal validity for the principles underlying those judgments. If lying is morally wrong, it is not wrong merely for me in my particular circumstances or because of my personal preferences, but wrong for anyone in relevantly similar circumstances who might contemplate similar actions. This universalizability seems to be built into the very concept of moral judgment itself, distinguishing genuine moral evaluation from mere expressions of preference or statements about what would be prudent or advantageous. The first and most famous formulation of the categorical imperative states clearly and precisely, "Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law governing all rational beings." This formula of universal law requires us to test our proposed actions by asking a crucial question. Could we consistently will that everyone should act on the same principle or maxim that we propose to follow? If universal adoption of our maxim would be impossible or self-contradictory, generating outcomes that undermine the very conditions that make the action possible, then the action is morally forbidden and must not be performed. If universal adoption is possible and consistent without contradiction, then the action is morally permissible though not necessarily required. And if we have an obligation to adopt the maxim universally, then the action is morally required as a duty. Kant illustrated this fundamental test with several examples that have become classical in moral philosophy and continue to be discussed extensively. Consider the maxim of making false promises when in financial difficulty in order to obtain money you need. If everyone universally adopted this maxim and made promises with no intention of keeping them whenever convenient, the entire institution of promising would collapse completely because no one would believe promises anymore or accept them as binding commitments. Since the maxim undermines and destroys the very social practice that makes it possible to make promises in the first place, it fails the test of universalizability and is therefore morally wrong regardless of beneficial consequences it might produce in particular cases. Similarly, consider the maxim of refusing to help others in distress when doing so would be inconvenient or costly. While it might be logically possible for everyone to adopt this maxim without direct contradiction, we cannot consistently will it as a universal law governing all rational beings. As finite, vulnerable beings, we inevitably face situations where we desperately need help from others to survive or flourish. Willing a world where no one ever helps anyone would be willing a world where we ourselves could never receive needed assistance, which contradicts our rational will for our own well-being and survival. Therefore, this maxim also fails the test, and helping others in genuine need becomes a moral duty. The second major formulation, known as the formula of humanity, states with equal precision, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always as an end in itself, and never merely as a means to achieving your goals. This formulation emphasizes the inherent dignity and worth of rational beings, and absolutely prohibits treating people as mere tools or instruments for achieving our objectives. It does not forbid treating people as means in the ordinary sense, since we do this legitimately whenever we employ someone to perform services or ask for directions from a stranger. Rather, it forbids treating them merely as means without any regard for their own rational agency, their own ends and purposes, their own capacity for autonomous choice. The formula of humanity captures something crucial about moral wrongness that the formula of universal law might miss or leave implicit. When we lie to someone, deceive them about relevant facts, coerce them through threats or violence, or manipulate them through psychological pressure, we treat them merely as obstacles to overcome or tools to use, rather than as rational agents deserving respect. This violates their fundamental dignity as persons regardless of whether our particular maxim could be universalized without contradiction. The formula of humanity thus provides both a test for moral action and a deeper explanation of why certain actions are intrinsically wrong independent of their consequences. Kant argued that these two formulations are ultimately equivalent, being different expressions of the same fundamental principle viewed from complementary perspectives. The formula of universal law emphasizes the form of moral action, its universalizability as law, while the formula of humanity emphasizes its matter, respect for rational nature as an end in itself. Both formulations derive from the same concept of rational agency as autonomous self-legislation. Rational beings can function as moral agents only if they can give universal laws to themselves through reason, and they deserve moral respect only because they possess this capacity for autonomy that makes moral action possible. A third formulation, the formula of the kingdom of ends, synthesizes the insights of the first two by envisioning a systematic union of different rational beings under common moral laws that all legislate together. In this ideal kingdom of ends, every rational being is simultaneously sovereign as a legislator of universal moral laws through reason and subject, as bound by the very laws they themselves legislate autonomously. This ideal moral community represents the goal toward which all moral action tends. A world where all rational beings treat each other with the respect due to autonomous moral agents capable of self-legislation. The categorical imperative differs fundamentally and irreconcilably from consequentialist approaches to ethics that judge actions exclusively by their results or outcomes. For Kant, the moral worth of an action depends entirely on the principle or maxim from which it is performed, not on its actual consequences, which may depend on factors beyond our control. An action performed from duty, from recognition that it is required by the moral law, possesses genuine moral worth even if unfortunate circumstances prevent it from producing beneficial results. Conversely, an action that happens to produce good results has no moral worth whatsoever if it is performed from selfish motives or mere inclination rather than from respect for moral duty and law. The concept of freedom stands at the absolute centre of Kantian moral philosophy and provides the essential connecting link between his theoretical philosophy and his practical philosophy. Without freedom, moral responsibility would be completely impossible and meaningless. Praise and blame would be arbitrary and unjustified, and the categorical imperative would be an empty formula without any application to actual human existence. But establishing the reality of freedom requires solving one of the most difficult and persistent problems in the entire history of philosophy. How can human beings be genuinely free in a world that appears to be governed throughout by universal natural laws of cause and effect? Kant distinguished several different but interconnected concepts of freedom, each playing a crucial role in his comprehensive moral theory. Negative freedom is independence from determination by sensible impulses and desires, the capacity to act independently of empirical motives that arise from our sensible nature. Positive freedom is the capacity for self-determination according to self-given rational principles, the ability to act according to principles that reason itself recognizes as universally valid rather than principles derived from inclination or desire. Transcendental freedom is the power to initiate new causal series spontaneously without being determined by antecedent natural causes, the metaphysical condition that makes moral responsibility possible in the first place. The problem of reconciling freedom with natural necessity had troubled philosophers for many centuries before Kant. If everything that happens in the natural world, including all human actions and choices, follows necessarily from universal causal laws operating without exception, how can human actions be free rather than completely determined by prior causes? Previous philosophers had either denied genuine freedom altogether, reducing all human action to natural causation and thereby eliminating moral responsibility, or denied the universality of natural laws by creating special exceptions for human action, thereby undermining the foundations of natural science. Both solutions seem to Kant fundamentally unsatisfactory, because they either eliminated what makes morality possible or undermined what makes science possible. Kant's brilliant solution depended crucially on his transcendental idealism and the fundamental distinction between phenomena and noumena established in the theoretical philosophy. As phenomenal beings existing within the framework of space, time, and natural causation, all human actions are indeed subject rigorously to universal natural laws without exception. Every human action, every choice, every decision has antecedent causes in prior mental states, environmental influences and physiological conditions that together with natural laws make that action causally inevitable. From the standpoint of empirical psychology and natural science, human behavior can in principle be predicted and explained exactly like any other natural phenomenon subject to causal laws. But as noumenal beings, as things in ourselves, independent of the conditions of sensible experience, we exist outside the framework of natural causation and possess transcendental freedom. This freedom is not the ability to act randomly without any reason or principle, which would be mere arbitrary caprice rather than genuine freedom. Rather, it is the capacity to act according to principles that we give ourselves through pure practical reason, independently of all empirical incentives arising from sensible desires. When we act morally from respect for duty, we do not simply respond mechanically to empirical incentives and psychological causes, but legislate universal moral laws through our own rational nature as noumenal beings. The doctrine of autonomy represents Kant's most distinctive and revolutionary contribution to moral philosophy in particular, and to understanding human nature in general. Autonomy means literally self-law or self-rule, and it captures the profound idea that moral agents must be the authors of the moral laws that bind them rather than merely following commands from external authorities. Unlike heteronymous principles that derive from sources outside the agent such as divine commands, social conventions or natural inclinations, autonomous moral principles derive from reason itself operating independently. When I act according to the categorical imperative, I am not obeying commands imposed from outside my rational nature, but legislating universal laws through my own reason, laws that bind me precisely because I give them to myself autonomously. This autonomy is what grants human beings their unique dignity, and makes them ends in themselves, rather than mere means to be used for purposes determined by others. Because rational beings can legislate moral laws through reason, independently of all external determination, they possess a worth that transcends all possible price and cannot be exchanged for anything equivalent or compared with anything else. This dignity is not earned through achievement or granted by others, or dependent on social recognition, but belongs necessarily to every rational being simply by virtue of possessing the capacity for moral self-determination through autonomous reason. It is the ultimate foundation of all human rights and the deepest basis for treating persons with the respect they inherently deserve. The goodwill, which Kant famously called the only thing that could be considered good, without qualification or limitation, is precisely the will that consistently chooses to act from duty rather than mere inclination. A good will is not one that always achieves beneficial results or successfully accomplishes its intended purposes, because circumstances beyond our control may prevent even the best intended actions from succeeding. Rather, a good will is one that makes its choices based on what the moral law requires through reason, regardless of personal desires, social pressures, expected consequences, or any other empirical considerations. This goodwill is the supreme expression of our autonomy and the ultimate source of our moral worth as rational beings capable of self-legislation. Kant's sophisticated account of moral motivation is both philosophically profound and psychologically realistic. He fully recognized that human beings are not pure rational agents, but finite beings with both sensible and rational natures existing simultaneously. We experience moral obligation as constraint or duty precisely because we have natural inclinations that often conflict sharply with what morality requires through reason. Purely rational being without any sensible nature would act morally spontaneously, without any sense of obligation or constraint because its will would conform automatically to rational principles, while a purely sensible being without rational capacity could not act morally at all because it would lack the capacity for rational self-determination according to universal principles. The distinctive human experience of moral obligation as duty reveals our dual nature as simultaneously phenomenal and noumenal beings. In the dialectic of practical reason, Kant addressed one of the most profound questions in moral philosophy. What may we rationally hope for having established what we must do through moral duty? after establishing that moral obligation is unconditional and that moral worth depends entirely on acting from respect for the moral law rather than from inclination or desire for happiness, Kant faced an apparent problem that seemed to undermine the coherence of morality itself. The moral law requires perfect virtue, complete conformity of the will to duty in all circumstances. Yet finite rational beings with sensible natures can never achieve moral perfection in this absolute sense. Moreover, morality seems to promise or at least suggest that virtue should ultimately be rewarded with happiness proportionate to moral worth. Yet ordinary experience clearly demonstrates that the virtuous often suffer terribly, while the wicked frequently prosper and enjoy worldly success. This profound tension led Kant to formulate what he called the antinomy of practical reason, a fundamental conflict within practical reason itself. On one hand, the moral law demands unconditionally that we strive toward the highest good, which Kant defined precisely as the complete combination of perfect virtue and happiness in exact proportion to moral desert. On the other hand, this highest good seems utterly impossible to achieve, either because perfect virtue exceeds human capacity entirely, or because the natural world governed by physical laws provides no guarantee whatsoever that virtue will be rewarded with proportionate happiness. If the highest good is both morally required as the complete object of practical reason and practically impossible to achieve, then moral action itself would become fundamentally irrational and self-defeating. Kant's ingenious solution was to argue that practical reason must postulate certain metaphysical conditions that make the highest good possible, even though theoretical reason demonstrated in the first critique that we cannot possess knowledge of these conditions through speculative philosophy. These postulates are not arbitrary assumptions made without rational justification, but rather necessary requirements that follow directly from the unconditional character of moral obligation itself. If we have an absolute duty to promote the highest good as the complete object of a pure will determined by moral law, then reason must assume that this highest good is genuinely possible to achieve, which in turn requires postulating freedom, immortality, and the existence of God as conditions of its possibility. These postulates represent a unique form of rational assent that is neither theoretical knowledge based on sensible intuition, nor mere subjective opinion based on personal preference, but rather practical faith grounded solidly in the objective requirements of moral obligation. The postulate of freedom proves the most fundamental because without it, moral obligation would be completely meaningless and empty. We cannot be held morally responsible for actions we cannot control through rational choice. Moral commands would be cruel mockery if we lacked the power to obey or disobey them through free self-determination. While theoretical reason in the first critique could not prove that we are free, indeed it suggested that everything in the phenomenal world of experience follows deterministic natural laws, practical reason must assume our freedom as an absolutely necessary condition of moral responsibility and obligation. This postulate does not extend our theoretical knowledge beyond the limits established in the first critique, but it provides a practical certainty based on our undeniable and inescapable awareness of moral obligation, which makes no sense unless we are genuinely free. The postulate of immortality addresses the serious problem that finite beings cannot achieve perfect virtue within the limited span of a single human lifetime. The moral law commands complete and absolute conformity of the will to duty in all circumstances without exception. Yet human beings with sensible natures remain forever susceptible to inclinations and desires that conflict with moral obligation and tempt us away from duty. Perfect virtue would require a will that spontaneously and invariably chooses duty over inclination in every possible situation without any internal conflict or temptation. But this ideal seems to lie completely beyond human capacity, as long as we possess sensible natures with desires and inclinations. Practical reason therefore postulates the immortality of the soul as providing unlimited time for endless moral progress toward the unattainable ideal of perfect virtue. This postulate does not promise that we will eventually achieve absolute moral perfection, which would contradict the essentially finite nature of human reason and will. Rather, it guarantees that moral progress can continue indefinitely, without reaching any absolute limit or final endpoint. Each individual can always become more virtuous, more consistent in choosing duty over mere inclination, more perfect in moral character and disposition. The postulate of immortality ensures that this progressive improvement is not arbitrarily cut short by physical death, but can continue throughout endless existence, approaching ever closer to the ideal without ever fully reaching it. The postulate of divine existence addresses the fundamental problem that virtue and happiness often fail to coincide or correspond in the natural world as we experience it. While virtue constitutes the supreme condition of the highest good and the only thing that makes happiness deserved, happiness remains nonetheless an essential component of the complete good, because rational beings naturally and legitimately desire their own well-being and flourishing. The moral law does not command us to be miserable or to reject happiness entirely, only to make virtue our highest priority and to seek happiness exclusively in ways that remain consistent with moral duty and respect for rational nature. But the natural world operates according to physical laws that take absolutely no account of moral merit or desert. There exists no natural mechanism that guarantees virtuous people will be happy, or that happiness will be distributed in proportion to virtue rather than to power, wealth, cunning, or mere chance. Practical reason, therefore, postulates the existence of God conceived as a moral ruler of the universe who possesses the power to coordinate the natural world with moral desert, the knowledge to judge moral worth accurately and completely, and the perfect justice to distribute happiness in exact proportion to genuine virtue. Only such a supreme being could guarantee that the moral order ultimately prevails over the merely natural order, and that the highest good becomes genuinely possible. This God is not the object of theoretical proof through speculative metaphysics, which the first critique showed to be impossible, but rather a practical postulate required necessarily by the demands of moral reasoning. God must possess the power to govern nature in accordance with moral principles, the omniscience to judge the true moral worth of every rational being, and the perfect justice to reward virtue with proportionate happiness. Only such a being could ensure that morality is not ultimately futile, and that the highest good toward which all moral action tends is genuinely achievable. The three critiques together constitute one of the most systematic and comprehensive philosophical achievements in the entire history of human thought. Each monumental work addresses a fundamental question about human reason and its proper employment in different domains of experience and action. While examined separately, they might appear as distinct investigations into unrelated topics. Together, they provide a complete and unified account of our cognitive capacities, our moral responsibilities, and our aesthetic sensibilities. The critique of pure reason establishes precisely what we can know through theoretical reason operating within the bounds of possible experience. The critique of practical reason determines authoritatively what we ought to do through moral reason legislating universal laws. And the critique of judgment bridges these seemingly disparate domains by showing how aesthetic and teleological judgment mediate between nature governed by causal necessity and freedom governed by moral law. This systematic unity was not merely an architectural achievement satisfying philosophical completeness for its own sake, but reflected Kant's deeper conviction about the essential unity of human reason itself as a single integrated faculty. Despite its different employments in theoretical, practical, and aesthetic contexts, reason operates according to consistent principles that reflect its fundamental nature as a faculty of systematic unity and autonomous legislation. Whether we are seeking theoretical knowledge of nature, making moral choices about how to act, or appreciating beauty in art and nature, we employ fundamentally the same rational capacity for bringing diverse manifolds under unity through concepts and principles that we give ourselves rather than receive passively from external sources beyond our control. The critical method developed systematically across the three critiques established an entirely new paradigm for philosophical investigation that continues to influence contemporary philosophy across multiple domains. Instead of beginning with dogmatic assumptions about the ultimate nature of reality and attempting to derive the conditions of knowledge and moral action from metaphysical first principles, Kant began with careful analysis of the actual capacities and inherent limitations of human reason itself as we encounter it in experience. This transcendental approach seeks to discover the a priori conditions that make experience, morality, and aesthetic judgment possible without claiming theoretical knowledge of things as they exist in themselves, independently of all possible human cognition and experience. Perhaps Kant's single most enduring contribution to philosophy and human self-understanding is his conception of human dignity grounded fundamentally in rational autonomy, rather than in any natural capacities or social relations. Unlike previous philosophers who located human worth in natural capacities like intelligence or strength, social relations like citizenship or family membership, or divine grace bestowed from above, Kant argued that dignity derives exclusively from the capacity for self-legislation through practical reason. This radical insight makes every rational being an end in itself, possessing unconditional worth that cannot be traded against any other values or interests, no matter how important they might seem. This conception of dignity has become absolutely foundational for modern human rights theory. Democratic political institutions designed to respect individual autonomy and international law governing the treatment of persons in war and peace. The influence of Kantian moral philosophy extends far beyond academic ethics pursued in universities to practical institutions and social movements that have transformed the modern world. The Categorical Imperative provides a powerful framework for evaluating laws, social policies, and individual actions that emphasizes universalizability and respect for persons as ends in themselves. Contemporary discussions of business ethics, medical ethics, environmental responsibility, and international relations regularly employ Kantian concepts and arguments, even when they are not explicitly attributed to their philosophical source. The emphasis on moral autonomy as self-legislation has profoundly influenced educational theory promoting critical thinking, psychotherapy, emphasizing personal responsibility, and approaches to criminal justice that stress rehabilitation and a moral development over mere punishment and incapacitation. Kant's aesthetic theory revolutionized thinking about art, beauty, and the role of imagination in human experience, and continues to shape contemporary aesthetics. The doctrine of aesthetic judgment as subjective in its basis, yet universal in its claims, helped establish the autonomy of aesthetic experience as a distinct domain with its own validity, while maintaining its deep connections to broader human values and rational capacities. The theory of genius as nature giving the rule to art provided an influential framework for understanding artistic creativity that shaped Romantic literature and art throughout the 19th century and continues to inform contemporary debates. Contemporary aesthetics continues to grapple seriously with Kantian questions about the relationship between aesthetic value and moral value, the nature of artistic meaning and interpretation, and the proper role of emotion and feeling in aesthetic experience and judgment. The critical philosophy also fundamentally transformed epistemology by demonstrating how knowledge depends essentially on the active contribution of the knowing subject, rather than on passive reception of independently given objects impressing themselves on consciousness. This profound insight anticipated later revolutionary developments in psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind that emphasized the constructive role of mental activity in perception, memory, and all forms of cognition. Contemporary discussions of conceptual schemes that organize experience, paradigm shifts in scientific understanding, and the social construction of knowledge through cultural practices all bear clear traces of Kantian themes about the mind's essential contribution to experience through a priori forms and categories. Even philosophers who ultimately reject specific Kantian doctrines as untenable often accept his basic insight that knowledge necessarily involves active synthesis between sensible content, received through intuition, and conceptual form contributed by understanding. In political philosophy, Kant's visionary conception of perpetual peace achieved through international law and democratic republican institutions has had profound and lasting practical influence on the development of global governance. The League of Nations, established after World War I, the United Nations founded after World War II, the International Court of Justice, and various human rights treaties all reflect distinctly Kantian ideas about resolving conflicts through law, rather than force and extending legal institutions gradually beyond national boundaries. Contemporary discussions of humanitarian intervention, cosmopolitan democracy, and global governance draw heavily and explicitly on Kantian themes about universal moral principles that transcend particular cultural traditions and the gradual extension of legal institutions to encompass all humanity. The questions Kant asked with systematic rigour remain absolutely central to human self-understanding in the modern world. What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? And what is the human being? His systematic attempt to answer these profound questions through critical analysis of reason itself established new standards for philosophical rigour and comprehensive systematic thinking that continue to inspire serious philosophical work across all domains.